I get asked almost constantly about decision making, and everyone seems to ask about the yes no questions because they're the easiest place to drop marks and they also take more time. So people get, especially once you get into the high 30s or high 40s in decision making, people are starting to nail the evaluating argument, the puzzles, the probability, the Venn diagrams, because there's really clear strategies for those, there's really clear definitions. Whereas the syllogisms, it's just so easy to lapse concentration and get 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5. And so hopefully today we're going to go through an approach that will distinguish syllogisms from inference and interpreting information, and will get you more 5 out of 5s because they are worth more per question than the other question types as well. So let's start with the syllogisms. Now, it's important to know the distinction between syllogisms and between inference and interpreting information. Syllogisms are the yes/no questions that occur at the start of the subtest. These will always be the first 5 or 6 questions. They have a relatively short stem, and they are basically just challenging your logic. So that's at the start, and in the middle, you'll get inference and interpreting information. Inference questions give you a more organized passage, something that could have been copy and pasted from verbal reasoning. So it'll read more fluently rather than being disjointed sentences. So if it says some borps are zorps, that's a syllogism. If it says the pancake parlor was established in etc., etc., that's an inference question. Interpreting information is again one of those yes/no questions in the middle of the subtest, but they have a graph or some table that you need to interpret. So that is grouped together with the inference questions, but if it's more of a passage, it's inference. If it's more of a graph or table, it's interpreting information. So now that we've covered that, I'm going to talk about the syllogisms first. It's hard to really say that there's a certain number of types of syllogisms, but my general framework is similar for all of them. Number one, read the prompt. Number two, organize the prompt somehow. You can do that either with a diagram or without a diagram, and I'm going to talk about what diagrams I draw and when, and then answer the question, ideally without repeating this. So once you read the prompt and organize it, you shouldn't read it again. And once you organize the prompt, you should just be able to answer bang, 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 and then move on. So a rough time slot, I'd say, is like 40 to 60 seconds would be pretty nice for the syllogisms. I would hesitate to be going above 75 seconds. So with regard to the diagrams, because this is where the money is, when you get a stem, sometimes, well, almost always, the stem isn't written in the easiest way to understand. If you were presenting that information, you wouldn't present it like that for optimal retention by the person reading it. So there's a few different options you have. The first option is Venn diagrams. People sometimes use Venn diagrams, and the arrow method is another common substitution here. Now, this is good sometimes. It's probably the most common diagram I use, but it's best when you get multiple words that say all, some, and none. So if I say all borps are zorps, it's really easy to put that information within the Venn diagram. It's not very good if you have things with like one or things with either, because there's no way of really saying in a Venn diagram that only one thing belongs or could belong in that category. The second diagram I do is a tree diagram. This I would use for things which say either or. So if I say, all people at the cinema are either adults or children, or all people at the cinema are either like Manchester United or Arsenal, that works really well with a tree diagram. Sometimes you can do a table, and that's more context dependent. It's not necessarily built on the words, but if it reads like a logical puzzle, then you can do a table. And then the final case is just no diagram. This is often for a short stem, which can't be organized because it's short and the sentences don't necessarily connect to each other. So, everyone at the company has to attend an event on Tuesday. Managers can be exempt if they have sick leave. You can't really do a diagram with that. But these 4 situations should accompany almost every syllogism. So sometimes it's okay not to do a diagram, but my general rule is if it is possible, it will help your timing and your accuracy to do a diagram. Once you get good, a proper diagram takes 10 seconds or less. However, any diagram you draw has weaknesses. And so Venn diagrams are a good example of that. Let's take an example where if I say all A are B and some A are C, I'll draw that A circle a bit bigger. So all A are B, some A are C. Okay, so let's just write that down. All A are B, some A are C. So all A are B, obviously it's a circle inside a circle. You have your A circle in here and your B circle is a bit bigger. But then when you draw the sum A are C, you've made an assumption here if you draw it this way. You're assuming that this category exists when it doesn't necessarily, or you're assuming that this category exists. It is hypothetically possible that amongst the C's, they're either in here or here. So some of these categories don't exist. Okay, you could easily draw C a different way. You could draw C like this, and then the statement would still hold. So because it's just a weakness in Venn diagrams itself that you can't elaborate that information. So there's a few different ways. I think first thing is just know that there's a weakness in that drawing. And once you're aware of that, then you can say, oh, even though I've drawn it this way, that's actually not the case. I can't say yes to that. The other thing that you could do is sometimes just put a question mark in here, just to remind yourself that category might not exist. So for each of these particular diagram types, there'll be some contexts and situations where it doesn't work as well. And when you do lots of examples, then you'll learn, oh, tables are normally pretty good, but sometimes they miss this. Now, my general advice with syllogisms is the answer is always no, unless it's a definite yes or has soft language. So if it's can't tell, the answer is no. You only say yes if it's a definite yes, or if it has words like could, can, may, might. So that's another important point to take home. All right, let's move on to the next question type, which are the inferences and interpreting information. And so I want you just to start with a definition of the syllogisms, which I just said, which is with regard to syllogisms, the answer is always no, unless it's a definite yes, or there is some soft language like could, can, may, might, some. Maybe we'll take out some because of the definition of that. Now, people often ask, there are official definitions. If you go UCAT consortium tutorials, there's a slideshow with decision making. It tells you the exact definitions. I think people now know that it goes none, one, some, and all. So one is excluded from some. So it's very actually hard to say yes to some because you always have this possibility of one. And then you have at least one, and then you have sort of few and most being less than more than 50%, but not all or none. So sometimes there are mistakes on metafile and meta entry on the question bank. There's always reasonable exceptions, and that's just unfortunate. The question banks that we have, none of them are perfect. I get frequent messages of people who just find exceptions which are completely valid. All right, so now with the inference questions, you can treat this like verbal reasoning. My general rule is I go passage first here. I read the passage. So step one is to read. Step two is to summarize. So I try and condense it down into the one or two lines that summarize the gist of that passage. A good way to practice is read it, cover it up, and then say, what is this passage about? And you'll find that that gets you probably two to three of the answers because they'll either contradict the main gist of that passage or they'll agree with it in broad terms. Now, your job is to make inferences. So don't rely on keywords so much. If it is broad and fits, you can say yes. So this is different to the syllogisms. The syllogisms, I was very harsh and said the answer is always no, unless it's a definite yes or you have soft language. Here, if it's broad, if it seems like it fits, just say yes. Same thing with all our verbal reasoning strategies. So if there's words like could, can, may, might, it's yes. If there's words like will, always, all, must, it's no. Now there's still can't tells. So if the answer is very detailed, if it has additional adjectives, adverbs, it's still can't tell and no. But particularly when the answer is broad, general statements like culture is an important part of humanity are very likely to be yes. So just bear that in mind. You can say yes more freely in the inference questions. That's the exception. The definition is always like they're different between VR and inference and syllogisms. Now, interpreting information is where you get a graph. So here I'd go question first, and it's the same as the syllogism. So the answer is always no, uh, unless it's a definite yes. So they will generally ask once or twice out of the five questions something that goes beyond the data, or maybe they'll have the weather in May, June, July, and then they'll say, all right, the weather in August is going to be this, or maybe this, or they'll give you the rainfall and they'll say the temperature is this. Those are can't tell, so it's no straight away. So basic things are the answer is no unless it's a definite yes for the interpreting information when there's a graph. Anything outside the graphs is can't tell and hence is no. Now, to save time, with the passage first approach, read the passage once, summarize it in your head, and try and answer as many of the answer options without looking back at the text. You should only look back if there was something that you wanted to reread for further clarity, or if there was that exact keyword. But just bear in mind, because you're making inferences, don't expect the keywords in the answers, in the five answer options, to be in the stem. With the interpreting information questions, they're a bit harder to get done quickly, but if you can identify this was not in the text, it's can't tell and no straight away, then it makes five prompts into three very quickly. Additionally, you may consider doing these question types at the end of your section, and then you can build up some time on the shorter question types. If you do Venn diagrams, probability, arguments quickly, you might have, a minute and a half for these questions at the end. Now, if you do have further questions, all you need to do is click the link in the description. I'll send you an email with some of my notes, which cover lots of the decision-making question types, and you can book in a free call with me there. I'll also be organizing a workshop, a 1 hour, 1.5 hour, once only class for charity that will cover my best strategies in decision-making. So I'd highly recommend clicking on the link, getting in touch, and then getting to that workshop because now we're at the pointy end with July and August coming around where 1 hour of insight, one change that you make could realistically make a 100-point difference on test day. So hopefully this was helpful. Let me know what further topics you'd like covered, but click the link in the description for more resources, which are free, and for more in-depth insights. Thanks very much.